It was a sunny afternoon in Maple Grove. Maple Grove was a quiet little neighborhood where houses sat in neat rows, lawns were green, and people waved hello to each other. Most folks there liked to mind their own business. They watered their flowers, walked their dogs, and went about their days without much fuss. Well, almost everyone did that. There was one person who didn't like quiet. One person who liked to poke her nose where it didn't belong. But before I tell you about her, let me introduce you to someone else, someone really important in the story. His name was Sam Carter. Sam was a guy who didn't talk a lot. He wasn't loud or showy like some people. He didn't drive a fancy car or wear shiny clothes. Nope, Sam was just a regular guy with a big smile and a scruffy old hat he wore every day. He lived in a small house at the end of Pine Street, the kind of house you might walk by and not even notice. It had a little porch with a creaky swing and a tiny backyard surrounded by a wooden fence. That backyard? That was Sam's favorite place in the whole world. Why? Because Sam loved two things more than anything, his tiny backyard garden and his bees. Yep, you heard me right, bees. Sam was a beekeeper. He had 3 little beehives tucked away in the corner of his yard. They were small wooden boxes, painted yellow, with tiny holes where the bees buzzed in and out all day long. Sam thought those bees were the coolest things ever. He loved watching them fly around, making honey in their little homes. To him, the bees were like his friends. He even talked to them sometimes, saying stuff like, "Hey, little buddies, you're doing great today." Most people didn't know about Sam's bees, though. He kept it quiet. He wasn't the kind of guy who bragged or made a big deal out of things. Sam's garden was small but special. He grew flowers, bright red ones, sunny yellow ones, and even some purple ones that smelled sweet. The bees loved those flowers. They'd zoom around, collecting nectar to make their honey. Sam would sit on his porch in the evenings, sipping lemonade, watching the bees do their work. It made him happy. He'd smile and think, life is good. His bees made the best honey, too golden and sweet, the kind that tastes like summer in a jar. Sam didn't sell it or anything. He just kept a few jars for himself and sometimes gave one to a neighbor if they were nice. Most folks in Maple Grove didn't pay much attention to Sam. He was just the quiet guy with the scruffy hat and the little house. Kids rode their bikes past his place, and grown ups nodded hello if they saw him outside. No one really stopped to chat or ask about his day. Sam didn't mind. He liked his quiet life. He liked his garden. And he really liked his bees. To him, that was enough. But someone did notice Sam. Someone who didn't like his quiet little world one bit. Someone who couldn't stand the sight of those beehives in his yard. Her name? Karen Phillips. Oh boy, where do I start with Karen? She wasn't like Sam at all. She was loud. She was bossy. And she thought she was the most important person in Maple Grove. Karen lived 3 houses down from Sam, in a big white house with perfect flowers and a shiny mailbox. She wasn't just any neighbor, though. She was the queen of the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. The HOA was a group of people who made rules for the neighborhood, like what color you could paint your house or how tall your grass could grow. Most folks didn't care much about the HOA. They just followed the rules and went on with their lives. But not Karen. To her, the HOA was everything. It was her kingdom, and she was the ruler. Karen loved being in charge. She'd walk around Maple Grove with a clipboard in her hand, scribbling notes about anything she didn't like. "That fence is too old," she'd say, pointing at someone's yard. "Those trash cans need to be hidden," she'd bark at another house. She had a sharp voice, the kind that made dogs hide under porches. Her hair was always perfect, pulled tight in a bun, and she wore bright red lipstick that matched her fancy shoes. Karen strutted around like she owned the whole neighborhood, not just her house, but every house, every tree, every blade of grass. To Karen, rules were the most important thing in the world. She didn't care if people liked her or not. She just wanted everyone to do what she said. If you broke one of her rules, or even if she just thought you did, she'd show up at your door with that clipboard, ready to tell you off. Most people in Maple Grove just rolled their eyes when they saw her coming. "Here comes Karen again," they'd whisper. They'd listen to her complaints, nod, and then forget about it as soon as she left. It was easier that way. But Sam? Sam wasn't like most people. He didn't even know Karen was watching him at first. He was too busy with his garden and his bees. He didn't think those little beehives in his yard were bothering anyone. They were quiet, just like him. The bees didn't fly into other people's yards or sting anyone. They just buzzed around Sam's flowers, doing their job. Sam figured no one would care. Why would they? It was his yard, his bees, his little world. Oh, but Karen cared. She cared a lot. One day, she was walking down Pine Street with her clipboard, looking for something to complain about. That's when she saw them, Sam's beehives. They were sitting there in the corner of his yard, all yellow and happy, with bees flying in and out. Karen stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes got narrow, and her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. Bees, she muttered to herself. Bees in my neighborhood. To Karen, those beehives were trouble. She didn't like bees. She didn't like honey. She didn't like anything she couldn't control. And Sam's bees? They were something she couldn't boss around. That made her mad. Really mad. She stood there, staring over Sam's fence, watching the bees buzz around. She didn't see a garden or a hobby. She saw a problem. A big, buzzing problem that she was going to fix. Karen didn't know Sam very well. To her, he was just a scruffy nobody with a weird hobby. She'd seen him around, sure, watering his flowers or sitting on his porch, but she never bothered to say hi. Why would she? He wasn't important. He wasn't fancy. He didn't have a big house or a loud voice like she did. In Karen's eyes, Sam was just some guy. Some guy with bees. And those bees? They had to go. Sam didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to make his quiet life a lot less quiet. She had her clipboard, her rules, and a plan. She thought she could march in and take over, like she always did. She thought Sam would just nod and do what she said, like everyone else. But here's the thing Karen didn't know, Sam wasn't like everyone else. He was quiet, sure, but he wasn't weak. He loved his bees, and he wasn't going to let anyone mess with them, not even the queen of the HOA. What Karen didn't see, what she couldn't see, was that Sam's quiet life was hiding something big. Something that was about to turn her perfect little world upside down. She thought she was the boss, the one in control. But Sam? Sam had his bees. And those bees were about to teach Karen a lesson she'd never forget. So, what do you think Karen's problem was with Sam? Was it the bees? The honey? Or just the fact that he didn't fit into her perfect neighborhood? Stick around, because this story's just getting started. Sam's quiet days are about to get loud, and Karen's loud days? They're about to get a whole lot messy. Keep listening, because you won't believe what happens next. Karen Phillips wasn't the kind of person who waited around. Nope, when she had a problem, she went straight for it, like a cat chasing a mouse. And to her, Sam Carter's bees were a big, buzzing problem. She didn't like them one bit. Not the bees, not the hives, not even the idea of them living in her perfect neighborhood. So, one bright and sunny day, Karen decided it was time to do something about it. She wasn't going to let those bees stay in Maple Grove, not if she had anything to say about it. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Sam was out on his little porch, just sitting there in his scruffy old hat. He had a glass of lemonade in his hand, and he was watching his bees buzz around the backyard. The bees were busy, flying from flower to flower, making that sweet honey Sam loved so much. He smiled to himself, thinking how lucky he was to have such cool little friends. Everything felt peaceful. Quiet. Nice. But then, out of nowhere, came Karen. She marched down Pine Street, her fancy shoes clicking on the sidewalk. She had her clipboard tucked under her arm, like always, and her lips were pressed into a thin, angry line. Her nose was wrinkled up, like she'd just smelled something stinky, maybe a skunk or some old trash. But there was no skunk. There was no trash. There was just Sam and his bees, minding their own business. Karen didn't knock on Sam's door like a normal person. Oh no. She stomped right up the steps of his porch, her eyes locked on him like he'd done something awful. Sam looked up, surprised. He wasn't used to visitors, especially not ones who looked so mad. Hi, Karen, he said, setting his lemonade down. What's up? Karen didn't say hi back. She didn't even try to be nice. She just pointed along, bony finger toward his backyard and snapped, "Those bees of yours are a danger." Her voice was sharp, like a teacher yelling at a kid who forgot their homework. "They're buzzing all over the place, and I won't have it. Not in my neighborhood." Sam blinked. He didn't get it. His bees weren't hurting anyone. They stayed in his yard, flying around his flowers. They didn't sting people or make trouble. "They're not dangerous," he said, keeping his voice calm. "They just make honey. That's all." But Karen wasn't done. She took a step closer, her nose still wrinkled like she could smell the bees from where she stood. "And that honey you're making," she said, her voice getting louder. "It's a sticky mess. It's disgusting. I bet it's all over your yard, dripping everywhere. That's not allowed here. I'm taking it to the HOA meeting to prove it's against the rules." Sam tilted his head, confused. "It's just honey, Karen," he said with a little shrug. "It's not a mess. It's in jars. The bees aren't hurting anyone." He didn't yell or get mad. That wasn't Sam's way. He stayed cool, like he always did. He figured if he explained it nice and simple, maybe Karen would calm down and leave him alone. But Karen? She didn't want to hear it. She didn't care what Sam had to say. To her, those bees were breaking her rules, and that was that. She smirked a mean little smile that showed she thought she'd already won. Then, before Sam could stop her, she reached down and grabbed something off his porch. It was a jar of his homemade honey, sitting there next to his lemonade. Sam had put it out just because it looked nice in the sunlight, all golden and pretty. But Karen didn't think it was pretty. She snatched it up like it was trash, holding it tight in her hand. "Hey!" Sam said, standing up quick. "That's mine." His voice wasn't loud, but you could tell he didn't like what she'd done. That honey wasn't just some sticky stuff to him. It was special. He'd worked hard for it. His bees had worked hard for it. It was his pride, his little piece of happiness. Karen didn't care. She turned on her heel, still smirking, and started walking away. "We'll see about that," she called over her shoulder, her voice all smug and sassy. "This is going to the HOA meeting, and those bees are gone." Her shoes clicked louder as she marched off, the jar of honey glinting in the sun like a prize she'd stolen. Sam stood there on his porch, watching her go. His hands were in his pockets, and his jaw was tight, like he was trying hard not to say something mean. He didn't yell after her. He didn't chase her. That wasn't Sam's style. But if you looked close, you could see his eyes narrow just a tiny bit. Inside, he wasn't calm anymore. Inside, he was boiling like a pot of water about to bubble over. He didn't like fighting, but he didn't like bullies either. And Karen? She was acting like a big, bossy bully. Sam sat back down on his porch swing, but he didn't pick up his lemonade. He just stared out at his backyard, where his bees were still buzzing around, happy as ever. They didn't know what had just happened. They didn't know Karen had taken their honey and was planning to get rid of them. But Sam knew. And that made him feel something he didn't feel very often: mad. Really mad. See, that honey wasn't just sugar water to Sam. It wasn't just something sweet to put on toast. It was his hard work. He'd spent hours with his bees, making sure they had enough flowers, keeping their hive safe from wind and rain. He'd watched them fly back and forth, carrying tiny bits of nectar to make that golden honey. Every jar was like a little trophy, a sign that he and his bees had done something good together. And now Karen had taken one of those jars, acting like it was hers to take. That wasn't fair. Not even a little bit. Sam didn't say much as he sat there. He wasn't a big talker. But inside his head, thoughts were spinning. He thought about Karen, strutting around with her clipboard, thinking she could boss everyone. He thought about his bees, buzzing away, not hurting a soul. And he thought about that jar of honey in Karen's hand, stolen right off his porch. It wasn't right. He knew that. And deep down, he knew he couldn't just let it go. Across the street, a couple of kids rode by on their bikes, laughing and ringing their bells. They didn't notice Sam sitting there, looking serious. Down the block, a dog barked, and a car drove by slow. Maple Grove went on like it always did, quiet and normal. But something was different now. Something was brewing. Karen thought she'd won. She thought she'd scared Sam into giving up his bees. She thought she was the queen of everything, and no one could stop her. Oh, how wrong she was. Karen didn't know Sam as well as she thought. Sure, he was quiet. Sure, he didn't fight back right away. But that didn't mean he was weak. Sam had a strength she didn't see, a quiet kind of strength that came from loving something and sticking up for it. His bees weren't just a hobby. They were his little buddies, his team. And that honey? It was proof of how much he cared. Karen didn't get that. She didn't get Sam at all. As the sun started to dip lower in the sky, Sam got up and walked to his backyard. He stood by his beehives, listening to the soft hum of the bees. They were still working, flying in and out, doing their job like nothing had happened. Sam crouched down and looked at them, his face serious but soft. "Don't worry," he whispered, so quiet no one else could hear. "We're not done yet." Karen thought she'd won the fight before it even started. She thought Sam would just sit there and let her take over. But she didn't know what was coming. She didn't know that Sam wasn't going to let her push him around. She didn't know that those bees, the ones she called a danger, were about to make her wish she'd never stepped onto Sam's porch. The tension was building, like a storm cloud, getting bigger and darker. Karen had her plan. She had Sam's honey. She had her HOA meeting all lined up. She was sure she'd get those bees kicked out of Maple Grove for good. But Sam? He had something, too. He had his bees. He had his garden. And he had a little spark inside him that Karen had just lit up, a spark that said, "No way, not my bees." So, what was going to happen next? Would Karen get her way? Would Sam just give up? Or was something bigger about to buzz into this quiet little neighborhood? Stick around, because this story's getting wilder, and you won't want to miss it. The sun was getting lower now, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Sam stood by his beehives, still watching his little bees buzz around. They didn't stop working, even as the day turned to evening. They just kept going, flying from flower to flower, carrying tiny drops of nectar back to their hives. Sam liked that about them. They were small, sure, but they never gave up. And right now, he felt like he couldn't give up either, not after what Karen had done. Back at her big white house, Karen was feeling pretty proud of herself. She sat at her kitchen table, the stolen jar of Sam's honey right in front of her. She tapped her fingers on the table, smiling that mean little smile of hers. To her, this wasn't just about bees or honey. It was about winning. Karen loved winning. She loved being the one in charge, the one who made the rules. And Sam? He was just some quiet guy who didn't fit into her perfect Maple Grove. She couldn't wait to show everyone at the HOA meeting that she was right, and he was wrong. Karen grabbed her clipboard and started writing. She scribbled fast, her pen scratching the paper like an angry bird. "Bees are dangerous," she wrote in big letters. "Honey is messy and against the rules." She added more stuff, too, like how Sam's hives were an eyesore and how they might sting someone someday. None of it was true, not really. Sam's bees didn't sting anyone, and his hives were neat and tidy in the corner of his yard. But Karen didn't care about the truth. She cared about getting her way. She looked at the jar of honey again and wrinkled her nose. "Sticky mess," she muttered, like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. She didn't taste it. She didn't even open it. To her, Sam's honey was just a proper thing to wave around at the meeting to make people agree with her. She put it in her bag, right next to her clipboard, and nodded to herself. "This'll show him," she said out loud. "No more bees in my neighborhood." Meanwhile, Sam was still in his backyard. The air was cooler now, and the bees were slowing down, getting ready to rest for the night. He sat on an old wooden chair next to the hives, his hands resting on his knees. He didn't say anything for a while, just listened to the soft hum of the bees. That sound always made him feel better. It was like music, quiet, steady music that told him everything was okay. But tonight, it didn't feel quite okay. Not with Karen out there, holding his honey like she'd won a prize. Sam thought back to what happened on his porch. He could still see Karen's smirky face, hear her sharp voice barking about his bees. A danger, she'd called them. That word stuck in his head like a splinter. A danger? His bees? They were the gentlest little things he'd ever met. Sure, they could sting if you scared them, but Sam made sure they never had to. He kept their hives safe, gave them plenty of flowers, and never let anyone bother them. They weren't dangerous. They were his buddies. And that honey? Sam shook his head just thinking about it. Karen called it a sticky mess, but she didn't know anything. She didn't know how long it took the bees to make it one tiny drop at a time, over weeks and weeks. She didn't know how Sam would sit by the hives, checking on them, making sure they had everything they needed. She didn't know how he'd smile when he scooped the honey into jars, proud of what he and his bees had made together. To her, it was just some gooey junk. To Sam, it was gold. He clenched his fists a little, then let them go. Getting mad wouldn't fix this, he told himself. Yelling at Karen wouldn't bring his honey back. But doing nothing? That didn't feel right either. Sam wasn't a fighter, not with words or fists. He didn't like arguing or making a fuss. But he also didn't like bullies. And right now, Karen was acting like the biggest bully in Maple Grove. The sky was almost dark now, and the street lights flickered on down Pine Street. Sam could hear crickets chirping and a dog barking a few houses away. He stood up and walked to his porch, his boots scuffing the grass. That's when he saw the empty spot where his honey jar used to be. It looked wrong, like a missing tooth in a smile. Karen had taken it, just snatched it right up and walked away. Sam's jaw got tight again, and he felt that boiling feeling bubble up inside him once more. He went inside his little house and shut the door. It was quiet in there, just the sound of a clock ticking on the wall. Sam sat at his tiny kitchen table, staring at nothing. He didn't turn on the TV or make dinner. He just sat, thinking. Karen thought she'd scared him. She thought he'd give up, let her win. She thought he was just some quiet guy who wouldn't fight back. But Sam wasn't scared. He was mad, quietly mad, the kind of mad that doesn't shout but grows stronger every minute. Outside, the bees were all tucked in their hives now, safe and sound. Sam could picture them, resting after a long day of work. He thought about how hard they tried, how they never stopped, even when things got tough. Maybe he could be like that, too. Maybe he didn't have to let Karen push him around. Maybe there was a way to push back quietly, smartly, in his own way. Karen, on the other hand, was already planning her big moment. She went to bed that night with a smile, dreaming of the HOA meeting. She could see it all in her head, her standing up front, holding Sam's honey jar, telling everyone how awful his bees were. She'd make them vote to ban the hives, and then she'd march back to Sam's house and tell him the news herself. She'd win. She always won. That's what she told herself as she fell asleep, her clipboard on the nightstand next to her. But back at Sam's house, something was different. He wasn't asleep. He was still at his table, his scruffy hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't have a clipboard or a loud voice like Karen. He didn't have fancy shoes or a big house. But he had something else. He had his bees. And he had an idea, a little spark of a plan starting to glow in his mind. The next morning, the sun came up over Maple Grove like it always did. Birds sang, lawns sparkled with dew, and everything looked peaceful. Karen got up early, humming to herself as she made coffee. She checked her clipboard, made sure the honey jar was in her bag, and nodded. Today was the day she'd fix Sam's little bee problem once and for all. She felt unstoppable. Sam got up early, too. He didn't hum or smile, but he wasn't moping either. He put on his hat, grabbed a cup of water, and went out to his backyard. The bees were already awake, buzzing around their hives like tiny workers starting their shift. Sam watched them for a long time, his face calm but his eyes sharp. "Morning, buddies," he said softly. "We've got some work to do." Karen didn't know it yet, but she'd started something she couldn't stop. She thought she'd taken control when she grabbed that honey jar. She thought she'd put Sam in his place. But Sam wasn't in his place anymore. He was moving, thinking, planning. And his bees? They were part of it, too. The tension in Maple Grove was growing thicker, like the air before a big rain. Karen was ready to fight with her words and her rules. Sam was ready to fight with something else, something quieter, something smarter. She thought she'd won the first round, walking off with his honey like a trophy. Oh, how wrong she was. The real fight was just beginning, and it was going to buzz right into her perfect little world. What do you think Sam's going to do? Will he let Karen win, or will he surprise her? Stick around, because this story's about to get even juicier and a whole lot buzzier. Days passed after Karen took Sam's honey jar, and things in Maple Grove didn't stay quiet for long. Karen wasn't the type to let something drop. Nope, she kept stirring up trouble, like a kid poking a stick into a puddle just to make it muddy. She had her prize, Sam's honey, and she wasn't going to stop until everyone in the neighborhood agreed with her. She wanted those bees gone, and she was ready to make a big fuss about it. It all started at the HOA meeting, a few nights after she'd marched off Sam's porch. The meeting was in the community center, a little building with folding chairs and a table up front. People showed up, some because they cared, some because they were just bored. Karen strutted in like she owned the place, her clipboard in one hand and Sam's honey jar in the other. She wore her fancy red shoes and a big smile, the kind that says, "I'm in charge here." The room got quiet when she stepped up to talk. "Listen up, everyone," Karen said, her voice loud and sharp. She held up the honey jar like it was something gross, like a dead bug she'd found. "This is from Sam Carter's yard. He's got bees, big, buzzing bees right here in Maple Grove. They're a health hazard. They could sting us, make us sick. And this honey? It's a sticky mess that's ruining our property values." She waved the jar around, letting it catch the light so everyone could see it. A few neighbors nodded, like they agreed with her. Old Mr. Jenkins, who lived next to the park, scratched his chin and said, "Bees could be trouble." Mrs. Lopez, who liked her lawn super neat, muttered, "I don't want sticky stuff near my house." Karen's smile got bigger. She was winning them over, just like she'd planned. She kept talking, whining about how Sam's hives were ugly and dangerous, how they didn't belong in a nice neighborhood like theirs. But Sam? He wasn't at the meeting. He didn't go. He didn't stand up and argue or try to tell his side. Nope, Sam stayed home, right where he always was, out in his backyard with his bees. While Karen was flapping her lips at the community center, Sam was kneeling by his hives, checking on his little buddies. He had his scruffy hat on, and his hands were gentle as he lifted the lid of one hive to peek inside. The bees buzzed around him, but they didn't sting. They knew Sam. They trusted him. To anyone watching, Sam looked like nothing was wrong. He acted calm, like Karen hadn't taken his honey or called his bees a danger. He watered his flowers, pulled a few weeds, and sat on his porch with a glass of lemonade, same as always. Most people in Maple Grove didn't even think twice about him. "There's Sam," they'd say if they passed by, then keep walking. He was just the quiet guy with the garden. Nothing special, right? But if you looked really close, you'd see something different. There was a little gleam in Sam's eye, a tiny spark that wasn't there before. It wasn't loud or obvious, like Karen's big mouth. It was quiet, sneaky, like a secret he was keeping to himself. Sam wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. Oh no. He was watching. He was thinking. And he was planning. Every night, when the sun went down and the neighborhood got quiet, Sam went out to his backyard. He'd stand by his beehives, the moon shining soft on the yellow boxes. The bees were still awake, buzzing a little as they settled in. Sam would crouch down, real close, and whisper to them. "Don't worry, little buddies," he'd say, his voice so soft you could barely hear it. "We'll fix this." And the bees? They buzzed louder, like they were answering him. Like they understood what he meant. Karen didn't know about those whispers. She didn't know Sam was out there every night, talking to his bees. She thought she'd humiliated him, made him feel small when she took his honey and yelled about his hives. She thought he'd given up, that he was too quiet to fight back. But Karen didn't see everything. She didn't notice the tiny clues popping up around her perfect little world, clues that something was brewing, and it wasn't just honey. The first clue was small, so small most people missed it. A few extra bees started showing up in Karen's yard. Not a lot, just 3 or 4, zooming around her perfect roses. Karen loved those roses. They were bright pink and red, lined up neat along her fence. She watered them every day, bragged about them to anyone who'd listen. "Best roses in Maple Grove," she'd say. But now, there were Sam's bees buzzing around them. They didn't sting or make a mess. They just flew in circles, like they were checking things out. Karen saw them one morning while she was sipping her coffee on her back porch. She squinted, her nose wrinkling like always. "What are those pests doing here?" she muttered. She swatted at the air with her hand, but the bees just dodged and kept buzzing. Karen didn't think much of it at first. Stupid bees, she grumbled, then went back inside. She didn't know those bees were from Sam's hives. She didn't know they were a sign. The next clue was a sound of faint hum near her backyard fence. It started a couple days after the HOA meeting. Karen didn't hear it right away. She was too busy planning her next move, writing more notes on her clipboard about how to get rid of Sam's bees for good. But one evening, when she was out watering her roses, she stopped. She tilted her head, listening. There it was, a soft, steady hum, like a tiny engine running. It was coming from the fence that separated her yard from the neighbors. "What's that?" Karen said to herself, frowning. She walked over, her fancy shoes sinking a little in the grass. She leaned close to the fence, putting her ear against the wood. The hum got a tiny bit louder. It wasn't loud enough to scare her, but it was enough to make her mad. "Those bees again," she snapped, stomping her foot. She didn't know for sure it was Sam's bees, but she blamed him anyway. "He's doing this on purpose," she said, even though she had no proof. Karen stormed back inside, slamming her door. She grabbed her phone and called Mr. Jenkins, the old guy who'd nodded at the meeting. "Sam's bees are buzzing by my fence," she whined. "They're everywhere. We need to do something." Mr. Jenkins just mumbled, "Sure," and hung up. Karen didn't care. She was sure Sam was up to something, even if she couldn't figure out what. But Sam? He didn't act like he was up to anything. He kept tending his bees, watering his flowers, sitting on his porch. Every day, he looked the same, quiet, calm, normal. Neighbors walked by and waved. "Hey, Sam," they'd say. "Hey," he'd say back, tipping his hat. No one asked about the HOA meeting or Karen's big speech. No one asked about his bees. And Sam didn't bring it up. He just smiled, that little smile of his, the one with that gleam hiding behind it. The days turned into a week, and Karen kept stirring the pot. She went to every neighbor she could find, knocking on doors with her clipboard and Sam's honey jar. "Look at this," she'd say, holding the jar up. "This is what Sam's bees are doing. We can't have this in Maple Grove." Some people nodded, some just shrugged and closed their doors. Karen didn't care who listened, as long as she got enough votes to ban the bees. She was loud, pushy, and sure she'd win. Meanwhile, more little clues kept popping up. One day, a couple of bees landed on Karen's mailbox, just sitting there like they were waiting for something. Another day, the hum by her fence got a tiny bit stronger, not loud, but enough to make her dog bark. Karen started to notice, and it made her madder every time. "Sam's sending his bees to bother me," she told Mrs. Lopez over the phone. "He's trying to ruin my yard." Mrs. Lopez just said, "Oh, dear," and hung up fast. Karen didn't have proof Sam was doing anything. She didn't see him sending bees her way or hear him laughing about it. But she felt it like a tickle in the back of her mind that something wasn't right. She started watching Sam's house from her window, peeking through her curtains. She'd see him out there, working in his yard, and squint. "What's he up to?" she'd mutter. She didn't know. She couldn't figure it out. And that's what made it so good. Sam wasn't loud or obvious like Karen. He didn't march around yelling or waving a clipboard. He was quiet, sneaky, smart. Every night, he'd whisper to his bees, "We'll fix this," and they'd buzz back, louder and louder. Those extra bees by Karen's roses. That hum by her fence. They weren't accidents. They were hints, tiny pieces of a plan Sam was building, slow and steady. Karen thought she'd humiliated Sam at that meeting. She thought she'd made him look small, weak, done. But she didn't see the gleam in his eye. She didn't hear the whispers in his backyard. She didn't know something was coming, something big, something buzzing, something she'd never expect. Sam wasn't giving up. He was getting ready. And his bees? They were ready, too. What do you think Sam was planning? Was he training his bees? Setting a trap? Any guesses? Keep watching, because this story's heating up, and it's about to get really good. The big day finally came. It was time for the next HOA meeting, and Maple Grove was buzzing, not with bees yet, but with excitement. Everyone knew Karen Phillips was on a mission. She'd been talking about Sam Carter's bees for days, telling anyone who'd listen that they had to go. She was sure this meeting would be her big win, the day she'd get those hives banned for good. And Sam? Well, he'd been quiet, like always. No one knew what he was thinking, but something big was about to happen. Something no one, especially Karen, saw coming. The meeting was set for Friday night at the community center. It was a small building with white walls and a squeaky wooden floor. Inside, there were rows of folding chairs, a long table up front, and a little fan spinning in the corner to keep the air moving. People started trickling in around 7 o'clock. Old Mr. Jenkins showed up with his cane, tapping it on the floor as he sat down. Mrs. Lopez came in, smoothing her skirt and whispering to her friend about Karen's latest rant. A few kids tagged along with their parents, fidgeting in their seats. It wasn't a huge crowd, just a dozen or so neighbors, but it was enough for Karen to make her move. Karen strutted in last, like she was the star of the show. She wore her fanciest outfit, red shoes, a crisp white shirt, and a big necklace that clinked when she moved. Her hair was pulled tight in a bun, and her lips were painted bright red, matching her shoes. In one hand, she held her clipboard, stuffed with notes about Sam's bees. In the other, she carried Sam's honey jar, the one she'd snatched from his porch. She held it high as she walked to the front of the room, her chin up like she was a queen stepping up to her throne. The HOA president, a quiet guy named Mr. Thompson, sat at the table up front. He adjusted his glasses and tapped a little hammer on the table to start the meeting. "Okay, folks," he said, his voice soft and tired. "Let's get going. Karen, you wanted to talk about something." Karen didn't wait for him to finish. She jumped right in, stepping to the center of the room. "Yes, I do," she said, her voice loud and sharp, cutting through the air like a whistle. She turned to the crowd, her eyes gleaming with confidence. "We've got a problem in Maple Grove, and its name is Sam Carter's bees." She held up the honey jar like it was a trophy, waving it so everyone could see. "This is proof. These bees are a danger, a big, buzzing danger. They sting, they make a mess, and this sticky honey is ruining our nice neighborhood. No more bees in Maple Grove. Tonight, we vote to ban them." She stood there, all smug, waiting for everyone to clap or cheer. A few people nodded, like Mr. Jenkins, who muttered, "Maybe she's right." Mrs. Lopez frowned and said, "I don't like messes." Karen's smile got bigger. She was sure she'd won. She'd been planning this for days, talking to neighbors, writing her notes, showing off that honey jar like it was the key to everything. She thought she had it all figured out. Sam wasn't even here to argue. He'd stayed home, like the quiet nobody she thought he was. This was her moment, and she was loving it. But then, just as Karen was about to keep talking, something happened. The big double doors at the back of the room creaked. Everyone turned their heads. The doors swung open wide, and in walked Sam Carter. He didn't rush or stomp like Karen. He moved slow and steady, his boots thumping softly on the wooden floor. He wore his scruffy old hat, pulled low over his eyes, and his hands were steady, not shaking a bit. In his arms, he carried a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, painted yellow like his beehives. It had tiny holes on the sides, and if you listened close, you could hear a faint hum coming from inside. The room went quiet. People stared, their eyes big with surprise. Mr. Jenkins leaned forward, squinting. Mrs. Lopez whispered, "What's he got there?" Even Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, sat up straighter, his glasses slipping down his nose. Sam didn't say anything at first. He just walked right up the aisle, calm as could be, and stopped a few steps from the table where Karen stood. He looked at her, his face blank but his eyes sharp like he knew something she didn't. Karen didn't like that. She rolled her eyes, crossing her arms over her clipboard. "What's this nonsense?" she barked, her voice loud and annoyed. "You're too late, Sam. We're voting your bees out tonight." She smirked, holding the honey jar higher, like she was daring him to argue. She thought he'd come to beg or say sorry. She thought she had him beat. But Sam didn't beg. He didn't even frown. He just smiled, a small, quiet smile that made Karen's smirk wobble a little. He set the wooden box down on the table, right in front of Mr. Thompson. The hum from inside got a tiny bit louder, and a few people in the crowd leaned closer, curious. Sam straightened up, looked straight at Karen, and said, "You wanted my honey, Karen." So I brought the whole crew. Before anyone could figure out what he meant, Sam reached down and lifted the lid off the box. And then whoosh, out flew a swarm of bees. Not a huge, scary cloud like in a movie, but just enough to make a point. Maybe 20 or 30 bees, buzzing loud and fast, zipped out of the box and filled the air. The room turned into chaos in a heartbeat. People gasped. Kids giggled. Mr. Jenkins dropped his cane with a clatter. And where did those bees go? Straight for Karen. They zoomed right at her, buzzing around her head like little fighter planes. Their wings made a whirring sound, loud enough to drown out her voice. Karen's smug face turned to panic. "AHH," she shrieked, swatting at the air with her clipboard. "Get them off me." But the bees didn't stop. They didn't sting her, not yet, but they kept circling, diving close to her face, her hair, her fancy necklace. In her flailing, Karen lost her grip on the honey jar. It slipped from her hand, tumbling to the floor with a loud crash. Glass shattered everywhere, and the golden honey splattered across the wood, making a sticky puddle. That's when the bees really went wild. They smelled their honey, the stuff they'd worked so hard to make, and zoomed down to it, buzzing louder than ever. Some flew back up to circle Karen again, like they were mad she'd taken it. Others zipped around the room, making little loops over the crowd. Karen kept shrieking, her arms waving like windmills. "Help! Get them away," she yelled, stumbling back until she bumped into the wall. Her perfect bun was coming loose, strands of hair sticking out all messy. Her red lipstick smeared when she wiped her face. She didn't look like a queen anymore, she looked like a kid who'd kicked a beehive and didn't know what to do. The crowd was a mix of shock and laughter. Mr. Jenkins chuckled, "Well, I'll be." Mrs. Lopez covered her mouth, trying not to giggle. The kids clapped and cheered, like it was the best show they'd ever seen. Mr. Thompson banged his hammer on the table, shouting, "Order! Order!" but no one listened. The bees had taken over, and Sam just stood there, calm as ever, watching it all. See, Sam wasn't just a beekeeper. He was a bee whisperer. He'd spent years with those little stingers, learning how they moved, how they thought. He'd whisper to them every night, telling them, "We'll fix this." And they listened. Those bees knew exactly who'd messed with their honey. They didn't fly at random, they went right for Karen, like they'd been waiting for this moment. It wasn't a big swarm, not enough to scare everyone, but just enough to show her who was boss. Karen kept swatting, her voice high and squeaky. "Sam, call them off," she yelled, but Sam didn't move. He crossed his arms, that little smile still on his face. "They're just saying hi," he said, his voice steady. "You took their honey. They don't like that." The bees buzzed around Karen for another minute, making her dance and stumble in her fancy shoes. Then, like magic, they started to calm down. Sam tapped the wooden box with his finger, just a light tap, and the bees flew back to it, one by one. They zipped inside, settling down with a soft hum. Sam put the lid back on, picked up the box, and looked at the crowd. "I think they've made their point," he said, simple as that. The room was quiet now, except for Karen's heavy breathing. She leaned against the wall, her face red, her hair a mess, staring at Sam like she couldn't believe what just happened. The honey puddle glistened on the floor, and the broken jar sparkled in the light. Everyone else stared, too, some with big eyes, some with grins. Sam had turned the whole meeting upside down, and he'd done it without raising his voice. Karen tried to talk. You can't," she stammered, but her words got lost. She didn't know what to say. For once, she wasn't in charge. Sam was. And his bees? They'd just shown everyone who really had the power in Maple Grove that night. What do you think happens next? Will Karen give up, or will she try something else? Stick around, this story's not over yet. The community center was a mess now, and it was all because of Sam and his bees. The honey puddle spread across the floor, sticky and shiny under the lights. Bits of broken glass from the jar sparkled like tiny stars, scattered everywhere. Karen stood against the wall, her fancy red shoe slipping a little as she tried to catch her breath. Her face was redder than her lipstick, and her hair stuck out in all directions, like she'd been caught in a windstorm. She didn't look like the queen of the HOA anymore. She looked like someone who'd just lost a fight and lost it big. The bees were back in their box now, buzzing softly inside as Sam held it steady. He hadn't moved from his spot by the table. His scruffy hat was still low over his eyes, and that little smile hadn't left his face. He didn't shout or cheer or act proud. He just stood there, calm and quiet, like he'd done nothing more than open a door. But everyone in the room knew better. Sam had done something huge. He'd turned Karen's big night into a buzzing disaster, and he'd done it with a box of bees. The crowd couldn't stop staring. Mr. Jenkins, the old guy with the cane, had a big grin on his face now. He leaned over to the person next to him and whispered, "That boy's got guts." Mrs. Lopez, who'd been nodding along with Karen before, was giggling behind her hand. Her shoulders shook as she tried to hide it, but you could tell she thought it was funny. The kids in the back row were the loudest. They clapped and bounced in their seats, shouting, "Do it again! Do it again!" They didn't care about rules or honey jars. They just loved the show. Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, was still banging his little hammer on the table, trying to get everyone to hush. "Order! Order, please," he kept saying, his voice cracking a little. His glasses were fogged up from all the excitement, and he wiped them with his sleeve, looking flustered. But no one paid attention. The room was too busy buzzing not with bees anymore, but with whispers and laughs. Sam's big move had flipped everything upside down, and no one knew what to do next. Karen finally pushed herself off the wall, her hands shaking as she tried to fix her hair. She brushed at her shirt, where a tiny spot of honey had splashed, and glared at Sam. You can't do this," she sputtered, her voice high and squeaky. "This is crazy. You brought bees in here. That's against the rules." She pointed at him with a shaky finger, like she was trying to take back control. But her words sounded weak now, not sharp like before. The bees had taken all her bossiness away. Sam didn't flinch. He tilted his head a little, looking at her with those sharp eyes. "You took my honey, Karen," he said, his voice steady and low. "You called my bees a danger. I just let them say what they think about that." He tapped the box again, and the soft hum inside got a tiny bit louder, like the bees were agreeing with him. Karen's eyes went wide, and she took a step back, like she thought they might fly out again. The crowd started whispering more. "He's right," someone said in the back. "She did take his honey," said Mrs. Lopez, not giggling anymore but nodding instead. Mr. Jenkins chuckled again and added, "Those bees sure didn't like it." People were starting to see it. Karen had pushed Sam too far, and now she was paying for it. Her big plan to ban the bees wasn't looking so smart anymore. Karen heard the whispers, and her face got even redder. She stomped her foot, making a little splash in the honey puddle. "This isn't over," she snapped, trying to sound tough. I'll call the police. Or the bug people. You can't just let bees loose like that." She waved her arms, her clipboard falling to the floor with a loud smack. She didn't pick it up. She was too busy trying to look important again, but it wasn't working. Everyone could see she was rattled. Sam didn't argue. He didn't need to. He just shrugged, like it didn't matter what she said. "They're back in the box now," he told her, patting it gently. "No harm done unless you count your jar." He nodded at the mess on the floor, and a few people laughed out loud. Karen's eyes darted to the broken glass and sticky honey, and she let out a little huff, like a kid who didn't get her way. Mr. Thompson finally got the room to quiet down a bit. He stood up, holding his hammer like a shield. Okay, he said, wiping his forehead. "Let's all calm down. Sam, why'd you bring those bees in here?" He sounded nervous, like he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Sam turned to him, still calm as ever. "Karen keeps saying my bees are trouble," he said. "She took my honey to prove it. I figured I'd let the bees show her they're not so bad. They just wanted their honey back." He said it so simple, so matter of fact, that it almost sounded normal, like bringing bees to a meeting was no big deal. But it was a big deal. A really big deal. The crowd started talking again, louder this time. "He's got a point," said a guy in a blue shirt near the door. "She did take it," said a mom with a kid on her lap. "Those bees knew her," shouted one of the kids, laughing. The room was splitting. Some people still sided with Karen, but more were leaning toward Sam now. His bees had made them think twice. Karen wasn't giving up yet. She straightened up, brushing her messy hair back with her hand. "This is ridiculous," she yelled, her voice cracking. He can't just scare us with bees and get away with it. We need to vote. Right now. No more bees in Maple Grove. She looked at Mr. Thompson, her eyes wild, like she was begging him to agree. Mr. Thompson hesitated. He glanced at Sam, then at the honey on the floor, then at the crowd. Well, he started, scratching his head, we were gonna vote, but, this changes things a little. He didn't know what to do. Karen had been so loud, so sure, but Sam's bees had stolen the show. The meeting wasn't going how anyone planned. Sam spoke up again, his voice cutting through the noise. I don't want trouble, he said, looking around at everyone. I just want my bees to stay. They don't hurt anyone. Karen's the one making a fuss. He held the box a little tighter, and the hum inside went quiet, like the bees were listening to him. You can vote if you want, but my bees aren't the problem here. That did it? The room erupted, some people clapping, some arguing, some just laughing at the whole crazy thing. Karen's face twisted up, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Not the problem, she shouted. They flew at me. They broke my jar. She pointed at the mess, like it was proof she was right. They broke your jar. Mrs. Lopez said, standing up. That was Sam's honey, Karen. You took it? A few people clapped for that, and Karen's mouth opened, then shut, like a fish out of water. She didn't have an answer. For the first time all night, she didn't know what to say. Sam stayed quiet, letting the crowd talk. He didn't need to say more. His bees had said it all. They weren't just bugs in a box, they were his team, his little stingers with a mission. Turns out, Sam wasn't just a beekeeper who liked honey. He was a bee whisperer, someone who knew his bees so well they'd follow him anywhere, even into a meeting to take on Karen. Those bees knew who'd messed with their honey, and they'd made sure everyone else knew, too. The chaos kept going. Mr. Thompson banged his hammer again, but it was no use. The kids were still cheering, bees. Bees. Mr. Jenkins was telling a story to the guy next to him about a beehive he saw once as a kid. Mrs. Lopez was arguing with another neighbor about whether honey was really that messy. And Karen? She just stood there, sticky and mad, staring at Sam like he'd ruined her whole world. And maybe he had. Because right then, in that noisy, honey-splattered room, Sam wasn't the quiet nobody anymore. He was the guy who'd brought his bees to fight back and won. Karen thought she'd had the upper hand, but Sam's big reveal showed everyone she was wrong. The bees weren't the danger. Karen's bossiness was. What happens next? Will the vote still happen? Will Karen try something else? Keep listening, this story's got more twists coming. The community center was a wild mess after Sam's bees flew out of that box. It was like a tornado had hit, but a funny one, not a scary one. Chairs were tipped over from people jumping up. The honey puddle on the floor was sticky and shiny, with little bits of broken glass sparkling in it. The air still buzzed with excitement, even though the bees were back in their box now. Everyone was talking, laughing, or shouting all at once. Sam's big move had turned the HOA meeting into something nobody would forget. Karen Phillips stood in the corner, looking like she'd been hit by a storm. Her arms were flapping, swatting at the air even though the bees were gone. Her perfect bun was falling apart, with hair sticking out all over like a bird's nest. Her fancy red shoes had honey on them, and her white shirt had a big sticky spot right on the front. She didn't look like the bossy queen of the HOA anymore. She looked silly, all red-faced and sweaty, trying to catch her breath after yelling so much. Mr. Thompson, the HOA president, was still up front, banging his little hammer on the table. Order! Order, he kept shouting, his voice hoarse. His glasses were crooked, and his face was pink from trying to control the room. But it was way too late for order. Sam's bees had stolen the show, and nobody was listening to Mr. Thompson anymore. The neighbors were too busy giggling or whispering to each other, pointing at Karen and the mess on the floor. The bees had calmed down fast after their big entrance. Once Sam tapped the box, they flew back inside like they knew the job was done. The soft hum coming from the little wooden box was the only sound left from them. Sam stood there, holding it steady, his scruffy hat still on his head. He didn't look mad or proud or scared, just calm, like always. But everyone could see he'd won. His bees had turned everything around in one buzzing minute. Karen finally stopped flailing. She leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she sucked in big breaths. Her face was bright red, and her eyes were wide, darting around the room. She didn't say anything for once, no yelling, no whining, no bossy orders. She just stood there, silent, staring at Sam like she couldn't believe what he'd done. The neighbors couldn't stop laughing at her. Mr. Jenkins, the old guy with the cane, was chuckling so hard his shoulders shook. "That's what you get, Karen," he called out, waving his hand. Mrs. Lopez laughed into her sleeve, trying to be polite but failing. Even the kids in the back were giggling, whispering, "She's all sticky now." Sam didn't laugh. He didn't need to. He picked up his little wooden box, holding it under one arm, and turned to Karen. Everyone got quiet, waiting to see what he'd say. He looked at her with those steady eyes, not angry, just firm. "Keep the honey," he said coolly, nodding at the puddle on the floor. "But leave my bees alone." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried across the room, clear and strong. It was like a line in the sand, simple, but nobody could miss what he meant. Karen's mouth opened, like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. She just blinked, her lips flapping a little. For the first time ever, she didn't have a comeback. The honey on the floor was hers now, sure, but it wasn't the win she'd wanted. It was a mess, just like her big plan. Sam's words hung in the air, and the crowd started nodding. "He's right," Mrs. Lopez said, crossing her arms. "She started this." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, still holding his hammer like it might help. Well," he stammered, looking from Sam to Karen to the neighbors. "I guess we should talk about this bee thing, huh? Anyone still want to vote?" He sounded unsure, like he didn't know what to do next. Karen's whole complaint, the one she'd been yelling about for days, was falling apart right in front of him. Mr. Jenkins spoke up first. "Vote? After that?" He laughed, tapping his cane on the floor. "Those bees didn't hurt nobody. Karen's the one making trouble." A few people clapped, agreeing with him. Mrs. Lopez nodded too. "She took his honey," she said. "That wasn't fair. I say we let Sam keep his bees." More people murmured, "Yeah, and leave him alone." The kids in the back cheered, "Bees. Bees," like it was a game. Karen's face went from red to white. She pushed off the wall, her hands balling into fists. "No," she squeaked, her voice shaky. "We can't let him keep those pests. They attacked me." She pointed at Sam, then at the box, then at the honey mess, like she was trying to prove something. But nobody was buying it anymore. Her words sounded whiny, not strong. "They didn't attack you," Sam said, his voice still calm. "They just wanted their honey back. You're fine." He shrugged, like it was no big deal. And it wasn't. Karen didn't have a single sting on her. She was just messy and mad, not hurt. The crowd saw that, and they started laughing again. "She's okay," one of the kids shouted, and everyone chuckled harder. Mr. Thompson banged his hammer one more time, finally getting a little quiet. All right," he said, wiping his forehead with a handkerchief. "Let's settle this. All in favor of letting Sam keep his bees, raise your hand." He looked around, waiting. Hands shot up. Mr. Jenkins, Mrs. Lopez, the guy in the blue shirt, the mom with the kid, and even some people who'd stayed quiet before. More than half the room had their hands up, waving them like flags. "And against?" Mr. Thompson asked, glancing at Karen. She raised her hand fast, glaring at everyone, but only a couple others joined her, two grumpy old guys who didn't like change. It wasn't even close. The bees were staying. The HOA dropped the whole complaint right then and there, just like that. Mr. Thompson scribbled something on his paper and said, "Okay, bees stay. Meeting's over." He banged the hammer again, and it was done. Karen let out a little yelp, like a puppy that got stepped on. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, but nobody cared. She grabbed her clipboard off the floor, her fingers sticky with honey, and stomped toward the door. Her shoes squeaked on the wood, leaving little honey prints behind her. She didn't look back. She slunk away, her head down, her perfect world shattered. The neighbors watched her go, some still snickering, some just shaking their heads. Karen was humiliated, and everyone knew it. Sam didn't stay to gloat. He didn't need to. He picked up his bee box, tipped his hat to Mr. Thompson, and started walking out. But as he headed for the doors, something cool happened. A few neighbors stood up and cheered. "Way to go, Sam!" Mr. Jenkins called, clapping his hands. "Good job," shouted Mrs. Lopez, giving him a big smile. The kids ran up, jumping around him. "Your bees are awesome," one of them said, grinning. Sam just nodded, his little smile growing a tiny bit bigger. "Thanks," he said softly, then kept walking. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The stars were out, twinkling over Maple Grove like nothing had happened. Sam strolled home down Pine Street, his boots crunching on the gravel. The wooden box hummed under his arm, his bees safe and happy inside. He didn't rush or look back. He didn't have to. His bees had saved the day, and his garden was safe. Karen wouldn't be bothering him anymore, not after that. Back at the community center, people were still talking as they left. "Did you see her face?" Mr. Jenkins said to Mrs. Lopez, laughing. "Priceless." She nodded. She thought she'd win, but Sam showed her. They picked up their stuff and headed out, still chatting about the bees and the honey and how Karen's big plan had flopped. The kids ran ahead, buzzing like bees, pretending to fly around. Even Mr. Thompson smiled a little as he locked up, muttering, "Never seen a meeting like that before." By the time Sam got home, the neighborhood was settling down. He stepped onto his porch, set the bee box down gently, and opened it up. The bees flew out slow, heading back to their hives in the backyard. Sam watched them go, his hands in his pockets. "Good work, buddies," he whispered, like he always did. The bees buzzed soft, like they were saying, "You're welcome." Karen didn't come back that night or the next day, or the day after that. Word got around Maple Grove fast. People said she was hiding in her big white house, too embarrassed to show her face. Her perfect roses still bloomed, but nobody saw her watering them for a while. Her clipboard stayed inside, and her loud voice went quiet. She'd lost, and she knew it. Justice was served, not with yelling or fighting, but with a little box of bees and a quiet guy who wouldn't let her push him around. Sam's life went back to normal, well, mostly. He tended his garden, watched his bees, and sat on his porch with his lemonade. But now, when neighbors passed by, they didn't just nod. They stopped to say hi. "Love your bees, Sam," Mr. Jenkins said one day, tipping his hat. "That honey looks tasty," Mrs. Lopez added, smiling. Sam shared a jar with her once, just to be nice. The kids started calling him Bee Man, and they'd wave whenever they rode their bikes past. Sam didn't mind. He liked the quiet, but a little friendly chatter was okay, too. The bees kept buzzing, making their honey like nothing had changed. Sam's tiny backyard stayed safe, his flowers bright and happy. Karen's big fuss had come and gone, and she didn't try again. She'd learned her lesson the hard way: don't mess with Sam Carter and his bees. Justice was served, sweet and simple, just like the honey on his porch. And that's how Sam turned the tables, one buzz at a time. It wasn't loud or flashy or full of yelling. It was quiet, smart, and strong, just like Sam and his bees. He didn't need to shout or fight with his fists. He let his little buddies do the talking, and boy, did they talk. They buzzed right into that HOA meeting and showed Karen Phillips who was really in charge. Not her clipboard, not her rules, not her fancy shoes, just a guy with a scruffy hat and a box of bees. Pretty cool, right? Think about it for a second. Karen thought she was the boss of everything. She walked around Maple Grove like she owned every house, every yard, every flower. She saw Sam's bees and decided they didn't belong, not because they were bad, but because she didn't like them. She took his honey, waved it around, and tried to make everyone agree with her. She thought Sam was just some quiet nobody who'd sit back and take it. But Sam showed her she was wrong. Really wrong. Sometimes, the smallest creatures and the quietest people pack the biggest sting. Sam's bees were tiny. You could hold one in your hand and barely feel it. But when they worked together, they were unstoppable. They didn't need to be big or loud to make a point. They just needed to be smart and brave, and they had Sam to help them. He was quiet, too. He didn't talk a lot or make a fuss. Most people didn't even notice him. But that didn't mean he was weak. It meant he was strong in a different way, a way Karen didn't see coming. Karen learned that the hard way. She walked into that meeting so sure she'd win. She had her honey jar, her big voice, and her bossy attitude. She thought Sam wouldn't fight back. But when those bees flew out, her whole plan fell apart like a house of cards in the wind. She ended up sticky, messy, and quiet for once, while Sam walked away with his bees and his garden safe. That's what happens when you pick on the wrong person or the wrong bees. So, next time you see someone minding their own business, maybe think twice before picking a fight. You might see them and think, oh, they're just quiet. They won't do anything. But quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet can mean strong. Quiet can mean smart. Quiet can mean they've got something up their sleeve or in their beehive that you don't know about. Sam proved that. He didn't need to be loud to win. He just needed his bees and a little bit of courage. Let's talk about courage for a minute. Courage isn't always running into a burning building or yelling at someone bigger than you. Sometimes, courage is standing up for what you love, even if you do it quietly. Sam loved his bees. They were his little buddies, his team. When Karen tried to take them away, he didn't just sit there. He didn't cry or give up. He made a plan, a sneaky, buzzing plan, and he stuck to it. That took guts. Not loud guts, but real guts. The kind that grows inside you when you care about something so much you can't let it go. And the bees? They had courage, too. They were tiny, but they flew out of that box like they were ready for anything. They didn't care that Karen was loud or bossy. They didn't care that they were in a room full of people. They just buzzed right at her, protecting their honey and their home. That's pretty brave for something so small, don't you think? It's like they were saying, we might be little, but we're not scared. That's a big lesson from this story. You don't have to be the loudest or the biggest to make a difference. You don't have to shout or push people around to be strong. Sometimes, the smallest things like a bee or the quietest people like Sam can change everything. Karen thought she was the queen, but Sam and his bees showed her that real power doesn't always yell. Sometimes, it buzzes. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever seen someone who's quiet, maybe someone who doesn't talk much or show off? Maybe it's a kid at school who sits by themselves, drawing or reading. Maybe it's a grown-up who doesn't say a lot but always gets stuff done. Next time you see them, don't think they're weak. They might be like Sam, quiet on the outside, but full of strength inside. They might have their own bees, their own way of standing up when it matters. You never know what's hiding behind a quiet smile. And what about the Karens out there? The ones who boss everyone around, thinking they're better than you? They might seem big and tough, like they can't lose. But this story shows they can. Karen thought she had it all figured out, but she didn't. She didn't see Sam coming. She didn't see his bees coming. She judged him because he was quiet, because he didn't fight her way. And that was her mistake. So, if someone tries to push you around, don't be afraid. You don't have to push back loud. You can push back smart, just like Sam did. This story's got a happy ending, too. Sam's bees stayed safe. His garden stayed safe. He went back to his quiet life, sitting on his porch, watching his little buddies buzz around. Karen didn't bother him anymore. She learned her lesson, one sticky, buzzing lesson she'd never forget. And the neighbors? They started seeing Sam differently. They waved more, smiled more, even stopped by to say hi. He wasn't just the quiet guy anymore. He was the guy who stood up to Karen with a box of bees. That's a pretty cool way to be remembered. So, what can you take from this? Be brave, even if you're small. Be strong, even if you're quiet. Don't let bullies like Karen push you around, because you've got your own power inside you. It might not look like much to them, but it's there, waiting for the right moment to buzz out and surprise everyone. Sam showed us that. His bees showed us that. And now, you know it, too. Let's think about one more thing. What if Sam hadn't stood up? What if he'd let Karen win? His bees would be gone. His garden wouldn't be the same. He'd be sitting on his porch, sad, with no buzzing buddies to keep him company. But he didn't let that happen. He fought back quietly, cleverly, and he won. That's inspiring, isn't it? It makes you wonder, what would you fight for? What's your beehive, the thing you love so much you'd stand up for it? Maybe it's your friends, your family, or something you make, like a drawing or a song. Whatever it is, don't let anyone take it away from you. Be like Sam. Find your buzz. What did you think of Sam's revenge? Was it cool? Funny? Smart? Drop a comment and let me know. I want to hear what you liked best, maybe the bees flying at Karen, or Sam's quiet smile, or how she ended up all sticky and mad. Tell me what you'd do if you were Sam. Would you use bees, or something else? I'm curious. And if you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up. It's fun to share tales like this, little guys winning, big bullies losing, and lots of buzzing in between. I've got more stories like this coming your way, so stick around. There's always another adventure waiting, another quiet hero with a big surprise. Who knows what'll happen next? Maybe more bees, or maybe something totally different. But one thing's for sure, it'll be awesome. So, remember Sam and his bees next time you're out there, doing your thing. Be brave, be smart, be you. Because sometimes, the quietest buzz can make the loudest noise. And that's a pretty great way to live.